It's Groundhog Day. Written and directed by Harold Ramis, Groundhog Day follows Phil Connors, a Pittsburgh-based weatherman played by Bill Murray, who's sent to Punxsutawney, Pennsylvania to cover the famous Groundhog Day. And you probably know the rest of this story, or at least you think you do. Because maybe, in your comfortable knowledge of the gist of Groundhog Day, you've sort of let yourself ignore it. Or, even if you have watched it recently, maybe you're taking for granted that the story is simple. That just some early 90s comedy that got by on being a Bill Murray film. Well, I'm here to tell you that it's not just some early 90s comedy. Groundhog Day is like onions, or life. It's got a lot of layers. And not everybody likes it. And if they don't, they're objectively wrong. If they don't like Groundhog's Day, I mean, the metaphor ends there. I don't actually care if you don't like onions. There's a lot more going on in Groundhog Day than you might think. This movie is a nexus of all major world beliefs. It's like the Dark Tower, if you will, because it connects all of our own little interpretations of the world into one shining center. For just one example, or 8, Jennifer Wood from Mental Floss created this list of 8 different creative interpretations of the film. And these are all interesting, but instead of going over this list, I want to present 3 fundamental lenses through which one might view the film. The psychological, the religious, and the philosophical. There's going to be some overlap with those 8 interpretations, but I like mine better. So first, what might a psychologist... Those kids left crap on the porch again. Might as well start it all over. Where were we? Right. What might a psychologist think of Groundhog's Day? Well, they might first think of how well the film presents Maslow's hierarchy of needs, a theory in psychology first proposed by Abraham Maslow in 1943. It's typically portrayed as a pyramid. It expresses the theory that people are going to seek out certain needs and desires before they're willing and or able to seek out other needs and desires. Like, if a person's drowning, they're going to worry about getting air before they worry about whether or not they're personally fulfilled at the factory they work at. Likewise, a person who can't afford rent is going to worry about how much money that factory pays before the fulfillment thing. We see Phil step by step climbing this pyramid and not really trying to fulfill any of his higher needs until he's got all of his more basic needs met. It follows Maslow's hierarchy surprisingly well, starting with the whole first act where we see Phil chasing after his baser and carnal desires. There's even a whole scene of him just eating food. And then later he dates around, and I could go on, but we see him fulfilling the bottom layer of the pyramid first. Then we see him trying to find a sense of belonging, developing prestige and esteem through developing new skills to get recognition from his community. Until finally, in that last day, he achieves self-actualization, and he transcends. It's not a perfect order, and psychology tells us that most people don't go through it in a perfect order, much like the stages of grief, which is another interpretation of the film. Self-actualization refers to a person's potential and the realization of what that potential is. And once Phil has moved past his own insecurities and flaws, and done so by helping others, he is finally able to achieve that. He is living his best life. I'm not trying to say that any of these are the right way to view Groundhog Day. I'm just trying to say that there are a lot of different ways to view it. I'm done with psychology now. We're on to religion, baby. A deeply religious person might look at Groundhog Day and say, "Oh my God, how did I forget about the poo? I can't believe I did it again." I know. I'll write it on my hand. Righto then. A deeply spiritual person might say Groundhog's Day teaches an important spiritual lesson. In fact, while researching this video, I found this article, which called Groundhog Day one of the most spiritually significant films of our age. So yeah, there's your proof that they'd say that. A Hindu person might see reincarnation, with its idea that if you grew enough in this lifetime, you'll come back in the next lifetime as something more able to grow again. Or maybe they'll see karma. Good things only start happening to Phil after he starts doing good things. A Buddhist person, from his or her point of view, might watch Groundhog Day and see rebirth, which refers to the teaching that the actions of a person lead to a new existence after death, in samsara, an endless cycle which is considered to be unsatisfactory and painful. And we know Phil much like me today for some reason, does that. This cycle is only ended if liberation is achieved by insight and the extinguishment of desire. A Buddhist might say that we watch Phil Connors achieve that liberation by slowly acquiring that insight over what you might call multiple lifetimes. But does he extinguish his desires? Well, not consciously. But as he climbs up that pyramid, don't we watch him sort of stop desiring those lesser things? Sure, he still needs to eat and is able to eat, but he stops desiring it quite as actively. He never does this again. We see Phil basically extinguish all of his basic earthly desires, mostly by fulfilling them, until he's so bored that he moves on to actually being himself. With no consequences to worry about at all, Phil actually ended up tending towards morality. This is one of the reasons I find Groundhog Day to be so optimistic, and I find myself to be feeling more optimistic every time I watch it. I could go on talking about a number of religions. A Christian might see a man die, be resurrected, and give back to his world something like salvation. That was one of the 8 creative interpretations. He literally saves almost everyone in the town, frequently from problems of their own creation, or sins. And he keeps doing it, whether or not they appreciate or even acknowledge him.
You little brat, you have never thanked me.
These are only the ways that 3 different religions might look at the movie. I'm not trying to avoid or downplay any other religious view on the film. And I'm not trying to say that if you belong to any of those religions, that's inherently how you feel about it. So many different people and so many different religions are going to have their own interesting way of viewing this movie. Because of course they do. It's an interesting film. And now moving on to philosophy. How does this keep happening? I wrote it on my... Of course. Stupid me. Ugh. It's so obvious when you think about it. I wrote it on my hand today, on a different today, but when I go back in time, it keeps going back to today. So I wouldn't have anything there because I didn't write it yesterday. So obviously, I couldn't remember not to step in the poo. The writing was never there. Simple solution this time, I'm just gonna tie this little string around my finger instead. That'll work great, but how to off myself this time? I don't want to do the toaster again because that was way too painful. And I want to do the gun again because, well, that's too political. I know.
Big money! Salvia, Salvia.
And finally, moving on to philosophy. Albert Camus is the philosopher that I most think would have something interesting to say about this 1993 Bill Murray comedy. See, Camus is famous for discussing an ancient Greek myth about a man named Sisyphus and asking us to view it in a new light. Sisyphus in the original myth is condemned by the gods for an eternity to repeatedly roll a boulder up a hill, only to have it roll down again every time when he got to the top, as a metaphor for the individual's persistent struggle against the essential absurdity of life. Camus said that the first step an individual must take is to accept the absurdity. If suicide is not an option, as it wasn't for Sisyphus, then the only alternative is to rebel by rejoicing in the act of rolling the boulder up the hill. This description almost perfectly defines life, which means, as you know, that it also defines Groundhog Day. He lives the same absurd struggle of a day over and over again, and he literally attempts suicide as an option. Finally, he accepts the absurdity of his situation and even begins to enjoy his silly and seemingly meaningless repetitive life. And then, of course, he transcends the daily struggle by breaking out of it. This wasn't an option for Sisyphus, and it may or may not be an option for us, but Camus would argue that both Sisyphus and Phil ended up happy, transcendence or not. If you're not a Christian or a Hindu or a follower of any kind of religion that offers some form of transcendence, then Camus' philosophy of the absurd might offer you a road to happiness that Phil Connors himself found. After accepting how insane and bonkers his world was, Phil Connors decided to be happy within it, and perhaps we can too, because life really is bonkers. And Groundhog Day is bonkers, because Groundhog Day is life. After that, Phil gets out of the loop. He's fully self-actualized, fully past living for himself, and he is living his life only to the benefit of others and the world. He was only able to do this after building himself up as a person, working on his flaws and insecurities, and then finally, the very best version of that day, February 2nd, Groundhog Day, the one that he lives right before breaking out of his loop, is spent serving others. Only then does his perfect match, Rita, accept him as her own perfect match. And then they decide to stay in Punxsutawney because Phil has found a sense of belonging, and he doesn't really mind his life being repetitive anymore. I find a lot of meaning in this silly Bill Murray comedy, and perhaps some of that meaning was not intended by the creators. But it's meaningful to me nonetheless. Wait a minute. Was there something that I'm forgetting? Of course.